We were hearing that dreadful flute again, and there at Hood de Vries there was a mixture of panic and incredulity, adventure and what seemed like possession. I was smoking in a deck chair on the western veranda when I heard Jessie scream. I sat up at once, tilting my head, and I heard it. As on the night before, it was coming from a distance on the river. Mrs. Nevinson, who had been in the pantry engaged in making a mayonnaise sauce, rushed into the dining room to see what was the matter with Jessie. But in the meantime Jessie had dashed into the sitting room to her father. I found her when I arrived in there, clutching his arm and staring distractedly about the room. Mr. Nevinson, I noticed, did not glance about him in this uncontrolled fashion, but kept gazing towards where I stood at the western door, which, as I might have mentioned before, was the door that gave on to the front of the veranda. To go down the front steps you had to pass through this door. Then Mrs. Nevinson appeared from the dining room, Timmikins behind her. "What's happened, Jessie? Are you all hearing the flute again?" Jessie nodded. "Yes, Mother. It's in here." We were involved in another terrible experience. In the story I call My Bones and My Flute. "Milton, are you hearing it too?" Mrs. Nevinson said. I told her yes, in a murmur. Abruptly I saw Mr. Nevinson shake off Jessie's hand and rise. There was deliberation rather than impatience in the action, and something trance-like and automatic in his demeanour impressed itself upon me. Jessie uttered a whimpering sound and murmured, "It's over there now, near the radio." She began to cringe off, moving towards her mother. Her father came straight towards me, but I could see that he was not looking at me, but past me at the doorway. "Where are you going to, sir?" "Out of my way, Milton," he said. I gripped his arm. "You can't go out there now, sir. It's nearly time for dinner." He tried to shake my hand off, breathing in a rasp and muttering a few words fiercely, but I held firm, and abruptly his efforts to resist ceased, and he stood gripping my arm and staring past my shoulder into the deep dusk outside. I could see perspiration in minute blebs on his forehead. The sound of the flute had ceased. I heard Jessie gasp, "It's stopped! It's gone!" She approached, and I felt her cold fingers close around my wrist. "What's Daddy looking at out there, Milton?" she asked. I did not reply, and just at that instant her father's manner relaxed. I sensed that deep breeze of relief rush through him. For a long moment there was silence among us. Mr. Nevinson began to fumble in his pocket for his pipe, and Jessie stared at him, her face very pale. Mrs. Nevinson stood near the chair in which her husband had recently sat. Even now I can see her aproned form and the fork in her hand, a dinner fork, with the creamy traces of mayonnaise still adhering to it. There was no jesting in her manner this time. Her face was puzzled and anxious, and feminine, by which I mean she had that ineffectual, dependent look which, as I have remarked before, a female in my way of viewing things ought to have. It was so obvious that the situation was completely beyond her, and like her daughter she did not attempt to make a show of being able to cope with it. At the door that gave into the dining room, Timmikins stared at us with his naive Indian eyes, blankly curious and wondering. There were 3 dinner plates and a napkin in his hands. I recall that for a brief second the fear that he might drop the plates darted through me. Later, at dinner, we hardly spoke. None of us ate heartily, and Jessie was very nervous. She kept glancing out of the window at the fireflies. More than once we heard the ominous bark of the baboons. Shortly before we rose, I drew the glances of the others to myself when I uttered a gasp. I had happened to lift my gaze and look through the window to my right, Above the black ragged top of the jungle, a bank of dense cloud had split to reveal part of a ruddy moon crescent. The sight startled me. I had not expected it, and I had never before seen the moon look so sinister and so lovely. Jessie craned her head past my shoulder to look at it, and in doing so her knuckles touched my bare arm. They were cold. She said in a soft voice that, yes, it was lovely but terrible. And just before we got up, she asked her father about the lights, whether he was going to have Rayburn switch off the petter engine at 10 o'clock, as on the night before. Her father said no. He had instructed Rayburn to let the petter plant go on all night. He added in a murmur that he thought it would be a good idea to let us keep together in the sitting room that evening until bedtime. He wanted to discuss one or two little things with us. So, when the meal was over, we went into the sitting room. Mr. Nevinson took the Morris chair near the table with the magazines, and Jessie and her mother seated themselves nearby on the Chesterfield. I was about to draw up a chair when Mrs. Nevinson said, "Come and sit with us here, Milton. There's plenty of room." And so I sat between the two of them on the Chesterfield. At any other time the solemnity of our behaviour would have seemed absurd, but on this night there was too much tenseness in the air, too much that was urgent and weighty in our minds. Only we who have been through it can know the unique strangeness of those days and evenings, the not too sane, aerial feeling of being in the midst of occult events, and yet still conscious of the commonplace routine of existence, seeing the furniture and the walls around us in that cottage, and outside the trees and the river and the sawmill and the labourers, normal, ordinary, feasible symbols of the physical world, and yet within ourselves, knowing that something beyond our control had intruded upon the accepted pattern of our human actions. Throughout the evening Mr. Nevinson was awkward and out of his element. I could see that discussions like this were entirely foreign to him, especially where his family was concerned. Like myself, he is of the undemonstrative type, and fears any situation in which there might be the possibility of a display of sentiment or emotion. Most of the time he kept toying with his pipe and staring at the magazines on the table beside him. Now and then he would take up a magazine and flick through the leaves aimlessly and self-consciously. He began by saying that we had seen for ourselves what we were up against, and that though it might seem a stupid thing for intelligent people to have to admit, well, there it was. The fact remained that we were being subjected to a series of hauntings. It was not pleasant to know that at any hour during the day or night this strange phenomenon might make itself obvious. What he had to say, he continued, was this: there was danger, immediate danger for Jessie and himself. In 2 or 3 weeks' time there would be danger for Milton too. After lighting his pipe he went on. Some uncanny force, he said, had begun to draw him impellingly outside the house whenever the flute made itself audible. He uttered an awkward, self-conscious chuckle, and his eyes lowered. Sounds nonsensical to say a thing like that, I know, but I can assure you it's the honest truth. And there's another thing. On the last 2 occasions I saw a distinct spectral figure. A spectral figure? Said Mrs. Nevinson. Her husband nodded. Yes, Nell. A spectral figure. A ghost, in vulgar terms, if you prefer it. It kept beckoning at me to follow it. You can smile over that. But that was exactly the impression that was left on me. None of us made any comment, and there were no smiles. We waited for him to go on, and after a silence he said that from what he could calculate, On the next occasion we heard the flute, Jessie would begin to be aware of this ghost figure, and would probably feel the urge to follow it outside. It would require an immense effort of will to resist the inclination. He spoke from experience. In fact, the impulse was such an overpowering one that he had no doubt that he himself would have yielded to it that evening had not Milton stopped him at the door. Until the danger we were up against had passed, we would have to take strict precautions to ensure that neither himself nor Jessie were allowed to give in to this urge. He had no doubt now that the woman at Horstenland, Matilda, had met her death because she had yielded to the impulse and followed this apparition when it beckoned. It was true that she had been bitten by a snake, but the fact remained that she had been lured to her fate by this sinister spectre. Afterwards I told him he had sounded like a prosecuting counsel addressing the jury. What he was going to suggest, he went on, was that a guard be placed over Jessie and himself, because, from what he could note, it might be necessary to restrain the two of them when the phenomenon occurred. And occur again it did. I'll tell you what happened then. It's another part of the story of My Bones and My Flute.